Have you ever truly heard the sound of silence? Not the tranquil silence of a meadow at dusk, filled with the hum of life and the breath of the earth, but the dead silence of a heart that has ceased to hope, of a soul that has forgotten its own song. This was the sound of Jerusalem. An unnamed plague was consuming the city, not a pestilence of the body, but a sickness that hardened the soul, an indifference that had become a callous shell around the people. They no longer looked to the heavens with searching eyes. The laughter of children grew scarce in the narrow alleys, and the prayers in the temple, though still spoken, were but the hollow echoes of habit. Faith had become a dusty heirloom, displayed for tradition, but no longer touched. In the midst of this sea of dying hope, there was one man who felt each faint heartbeat of the city as if it were his own. He was Isaiah, a poet with a sensitive soul, a priest with a loyal heart, a man being broken by what he saw. He did not just see the apathy, he could taste its bitterness in the air he breathed. He did not just hear the silence, he felt its crushing weight upon his chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. To others, it was a counterfeit peace. To him, it was the symptom of a spiritual death closing in. Standing on a high balcony, looking down upon the city as it sank into the evening shadows, Isaiah was a solitary figure. A cold wind swept past, whipping his hair and the hem of his robe. His closest friend, Jeremiah, approached from behind, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That look in your eyes again," Jeremiah said, his voice laced with concern. "You look at the city as if you're watching a loved one fade away." Isaiah, the sorrow of all Judah seems to rest upon your shoulders. Isaiah did not turn, his somber voice mingling with the wind, because perhaps it is. "My friend, can you hear it? Truly listen. That silence, it isn't quiet, it is screaming. A silent, collective scream from tens of thousands of lost souls. Where is God when his people have forgotten how to call his name with their hearts?" Jeremiah sighed. "War looms at the borders. The king is weak and lost in political alliances. People are afraid." Isaiah, "It is only natural for men to fear when danger is near." At this, Isaiah turned, a painful fire igniting in his eyes as he faced his friend. "No, you don't understand, Jeremiah. This is no longer simple fear. It has curdled into emptiness. Fear still makes a man pray. Even in desperation, emptiness does not. We have built higher walls of stone to guard against visible enemies, but we have allowed the walls of our souls to crumble into dust. We polish the golden censers in the temple with silk, but we allow our own hearts to be eaten by rust. We have become beautifully painted tombs." A storm was raging in Isaiah's chest, a holy anguish he could not name. He knew he had to do something, yet he was as helpless as a man watching a fire with no water to quench it. He felt like a solitary voice in a silent desert, a single stray note in a symphony that had fallen silent. That night, as darkness fully swallowed the city, he made a decision. He would go into the temple alone, not to perform the empty rituals, but to scream into the silence, to confront the void he believed God had left behind. He did not know that in that very void, an answer greater and more terrifying than anything he could have imagined was waiting. What happens when a single, shattered cry pierces the silence of the heavens? The answer would change the course of history forever. The silence in the great hall of the temple was so profound that Isaiah could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, the desperate rhythm of his own heart. On his knees before the altar of incense, his face a mask of shadows in the flickering lamplight, he did not pray with hollow words. He poured his brokenness, the full weight of the city's despair, into the oppressive silence. "Lord," his soul cried out without a sound, "if you are still there, if you still listen, say something, a word of judgment, a clap of thunder. Anything is better than this cold emptiness. I can no longer bear your absence." As the desperate thought formed, a sudden, powerful wind ripped through the hall. Though all the doors were sealed, it was a supernatural gale that extinguished every oil lamp in an instant. Absolute, palpable darkness descended. Isaiah held his breath, his heart seizing in his chest. Then, from behind the thick veil that shielded the Holy of Holies, a light began to glow. It grew into a blinding, living brilliance, so intense that Isaiah instinctively threw his hands over his eyes, feeling as if he was staring into the sun. The marble floor beneath him began to tremble, not with a common earthquake, but with a deep, résonnant vibration. As if the very foundations of creation were shifting, the air grew thick, charged with a presence that made every breath shallow and labored. When Isaiah dared to peek through his trembling fingers, he beheld a sight that defied all human language. A throne, high and lifted up, seeming to touch the ends of the universe, fashioned from pure light and holy fire, and seated on the throne was a being whose majesty made the cosmos seem like a speck of dust, the hem of his robe filling the entire temple. Majestats, 6-winged creatures, the seraphim, hovered in constant motion around the throne. With 2 wings they covered their holy faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew within the glorious presence. A Majestats. Multi-layered chorus thundered through the space, shaking the temple and Isaiah's soul to their core. Holy, 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 they sang, their voices a living truth. The Lord of hosts is holy. The whole earth is full of his glory. Each declaration of holy was like a hammer blow, shattering the pride and self-righteousness in Isaiah's spirit. In the face of this absolute, untainted purity, he was suddenly and painfully aware of his own filth, the filth of his people. His brokenness no longer felt like the noble sorrow of a righteous man. It was an ugly stain before the perfection of the Creator. Woe is me, I am lost, he sobbed, his face wet with tears. I will be consumed, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Instantly, one of the seraphim flew to the altar of burnt offering, and, with a pair of golden tongs, took a glowing, red-hot coal. The ember radiated an immense heat, warping the air around it. The angel flew to the terrified, cowering Isaiah. Do not be afraid, mortal. The angel's voice was both the thunder of a storm and the gentleness of cool water. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is purged. The angel touched the burning coal to Isaiah's lips. He felt a shearing, indescribable pain, a holy fire that burned away every deceitful word, every empty prayer, every bitter complaint. But miraculously, the pain brought with it a profound release, a cleansing that reached the marrow of his bones. And then, as the pain subsided, a voice spoke from the throne. It was not a voice of judgment, but a question that pierced the heart of all things, a question that seemed to hold the very plan of the universe. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? To solve the riddle of glory and suffering, of kingship and service. Who will speak of light to those who love the darkness? The question hung in the radiant air, awaiting a response. It was more than a mission. It was an invitation into the center of a great mystery. Isaiah, his lips still tingling with the sacred heat, his soul newly washed, slowly lifted his head. The mortal fear remained, but a new courage, a dawning understanding, filled him. He was being called, not because he was worthy, but because he knew he was unworthy. A clear, resolute answer came from his lips, echoing in the silence that followed the hymn. Here I am, send me. Dawn broke over Jerusalem. Isaiah emerged from the temple, not with the exhausted air of a man who had been awake all night, but with a strange energy radiating from within him. His eyes, once so mournful, now held a determined fire. He had entered the temple seeking an answer, and had emerged carrying a greater question for the world. His mission was clear, yet impossibly complex. He had to proclaim 2 seemingly contradictory halves of a single truth. He had to paint a portrait with two faces, that of a king and that of a servant, and convince a blind nation that they belonged to the same person. His first task was to sow a seed of hope they had long forgotten. He stood in a corner of the main square, where farmers from the villages sold their wares and city dwellers exchanged grim political news. Taking a deep breath, he let the silence of the crowd hang for a moment, and then his voice rose, clear and powerful, the voice of a poet, tempered by holy fire. O people of Judah, O children of Jerusalem, listen, open your ears, you who have grown deaf from lamenting. For thus says the Lord of hosts, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. A murmur went through the crowd. A few people stopped, intrigued. Most continued their business, but they were listening. There was a new authority in Isaiah's voice. His voice grew in power, painting a vivid picture. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. These words were like rain after years of drought. Prince of Peace, justice, forever. These were the words the people of Judah longed to hear. A flicker of hope ignited in a few eyes. They were weary of weak kings and empty political promises. A king sent by God himself, an eternal kingdom. It was the deliverance they had dreamed of. Standing in the crowd, Jeremiah watched his friend with a mixture of awe and anxiety. He saw the rare smiles, but he also saw the skepticism. It is Isaiah again. A merchant muttered to his neighbor, always with the beautiful words, "But where will this king come from? We are surrounded by armies. We need swords, not poems." At the edge of the crowd, the high priest Eliab, an older man with a meticulously trimmed beard and a cold, self-satisfied gaze, stood with several other priests. He folded his arms, listening with a cynical smirk. "Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace," he whispered to a younger priest. "This boy Isaiah has a rich imagination. He is peddling dangerous fantasies. The people need practical guidance from the law, from the rituals, not impossible dreams." Eliab saw Isaiah not as a prophet, but as a rival, a disruptor of the traditional order he had worked so hard to maintain. To Eliab, faith was a system of controllable rules and ceremonies. What Isaiah was preaching was wild, unpredictable, and came directly from a source he could not command. When Isaiah finished, the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying a mix of emotions. Jeremiah approached his friend. "You have lit a small fire today, Isaiah, but did you see Eliab's eyes? He looked at you as if you were a viper in the temple courtyard." Isaiah's gaze was distant. "I know, but this was only the first half of the story, Jeremiah, the easy half. They long for a king, a liberator. But are they prepared to hear the cost of that kingdom?" He knew the hardest part of his mission was still ahead. He had shown them the face of the glorious king, but now he had to prepare to reveal the other face, the veiled face, an image that would defy all their expectations and thrust him into the eye of the storm of rejection. The second piece of the riddle was about to be revealed. Hope is a dangerous thing. It can lift a soul to the heavens, but it can also make the fall into despair that much deeper. Isaiah knew this. In the days that followed, the rumor of the Prince of Peace spread like wildfire, and a tentative expectation began to stir in the heavy air of Jerusalem. People sought Isaiah out, eager to hear more about this glorious king, but he knew he could not show the people the crown without also showing them the cross. He had to present the second piece of the divine riddle, the piece about sacrifice, about a path to redemption paved not with roses, but with thorns. He chose the temple courtyard, where the scholars and the devout often gathered, as the place to reveal this difficult truth. A larger crowd than before had gathered around him. Among them were High Priest Eliab and his priests, standing in a place of honor, ready to pass judgment. "Prophet," a man shouted, "tell us more of the king. Will he come with a sword of fire and chariots of gold? How will he crush our enemies?" An expectant silence fell. All eyes were on Isaiah, but instead of meeting their excitement, he bowed his head for a moment, his face etched with a pained expression. When he looked up, his voice was no longer a trumpet of triumph, but a low, sorrowful tone. "You seek a king, but would you recognize him when he comes? For the Lord has shown me another image, an image of his servant." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. The servant. The word sounded weak, unbefitting a liberator. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Expectation turned to confusion, and excitement gave way to disappointment. Isaiah's words were a bucket of cold water on the very fire of hope he had just kindled. They wanted a king like David, a conquering hero. He was giving them a nobody. His voice became a haunting lament, as if he were reliving a nightmare. He grew up before the Lord like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He closed his eyes, as if seeing the vision itself. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. The silence was now heavy and hostile. High Priest Eliab smiled a triumphant, knowing smile. His moment had come. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with authority and condescension. "Enough. Isaiah, this is blasphemy. First, you weave a fantasy of a king to lull the people to sleep. Now you speak of a failure. Azikman, does the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ever choose someone so weak to be his servant? You are insulting his majesty. You are sowing chaos." Eliab's words were the spark. The crowd erupted. Their disappointment quickly curdled into anger. "We don't need a suffering servant. We suffer enough already." A woman screamed, "We need a warrior, not a sick man." An old soldier shouted, shaking his fist, "Be gone, prophet of gloom." Isaiah stood there, in the heart of the storm of anger, but he did not retreat. He had foreseen this in his soul. He looked at the faces, twisted with fury, and his heart filled with a vast sadness, not for himself, but for them. They were unknowingly rejecting their own salvation. He raised his voice above the din. "But surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Let's go." "Isaiah." "Now," Jeremiah urged, pushing through the crowd and grabbing his friend's arm. "They will stone you." As Jeremiah pulled him away from the increasingly aggressive crowd, Isaiah looked back. His eyes met the triumphant gaze of Eliab. He knew this was only the beginning. He had presented both faces of the one to come, and in doing so, he had made himself an enemy to both sides, the dreamers of glory and the pragmatists of earthly power. He was now utterly alone. The path ahead was no longer paved with just skepticism, but with open hatred. There are many ways to kill a man. The cruelest is not with a sword, but by stripping him of his community, by turning him into a ghost among the living. This is what Jerusalem did to Isaiah. In the weeks that followed, an invisible but solid wall was erected around him, a wall built of contemptuous silence, venomous whispers, and averted gazes. The prophecy of the suffering servant had become a bitter joke in the city. He was no longer a controversial prophet. He was a madman, a disgrace. And the chief architect of this wall of rejection was none other than High Priest Eliab. One morning in the temple courtyard, Eliab was expounding the law to a group of young priests and dignitaries. Seeing Isaiah walking alone in the distance, Eliab deliberately raised his voice so that Isaiah and those nearby could hear. "Beware of false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. They speak words that sound deep, but they sow seeds of weakness and despair. Our God is a God of strength, of order, of holiness defined by the law. He never works through the unstable, through those who speak of a failed Messiah. The men around Eliab nodded in agreement, glancing at Isaiah with disdain. Isaiah simply walked past in silence. But each of Eliab's words was a needle prick to his heart. The official seal of rejection had been stamped upon him by the religious leadership. The shunning spread like an oil slick. In the marketplace, merchants who had once greeted him now turned their backs. "Don't buy from the mad prophet's family," they would whisper, "lest you invite bad fortune." Old friends he had grown up with now crossed the street to avoid him. The isolation became tangible and painful, but the deepest wound came from the place he least expected, his own family. That evening, his cousin Eliab, a wealthy and respected merchant, stormed into his house, his face a mask of fury and shame. "Isaiah, do you know what you are doing? You are destroying our family's name," he yelled. Isaiah looked up, his voice weary. "I am only speaking what the Lord has shown me, cousin, the Lord, or your madness." The merchant slammed his hand on the table. "My business partners no longer want to deal with me. My daughters are shunned by their friends at the village. Well, they call them the failed prophet's nieces. We have become a laughing stock. For the sake of your family, for those who love you, be silent. Stop speaking of that sick servant." Isaiah rose, looking his cousin in the eye, a deep pain reflected in his own. "Do you think I want this? Do you think I enjoy being an outcast? But I cannot be silent. I cannot betray the vision." He seared into my soul with fire. His word is more real than the contempt of men. His cousin shook his head, his voice cold as ice. "Then bear the consequences alone. Do not consider us your family anymore. As of today, I have no cousin named Isaiah." He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Isaiah stood frozen. The wall of rejection was now complete, with no cracks left. He had lost his friends, his reputation, and now his family. Jeremiah, who had heard everything from outside, entered the room. "Isaiah, I don't know what to say. Even your own family." Isaiah turned, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, but his voice was strangely calm. "They are like all the others, Jeremiah. They fear what they do not understand. They want a savior on their own terms, one who doesn't demand they change, one who doesn't challenge their comfort. But what will you do now? You have nothing left," Jeremiah said. Isaiah looked out the window toward the desolate hills outside the city. Perhaps to truly understand the servant's sorrow, he must first test their reaction. Perhaps this is the only way. "I will not stop speaking, Jeremiah, even if the only ones left to listen are the stones in the desert." Isaiah had reached the bottom of solitude, abandoned by the world. He was left with only his visions. He thought he could not possibly hurt more. He was wrong. It was in this darkness of despair that God was about to show him one final, terrible vision, one so horrific it would make all his previous suffering seem like a faint shadow. He was about to witness the true cost of redemption. When a man is abandoned by the world, he has only one place to turn, to God. But what happens when even God seems silent? That night, Isaiah did not go home, nor to the temple. He sought out a desolate hill outside the walls of Jerusalem, a place of gravel, thorns, and the mournful howling of the wind. He needed a place where the silence of nature might soothe the screaming in his soul. Kneeling on the hard, cold ground, he looked up at the starless sky, feeling he had reached the end of his endurance. Doubt, a cold viper, began to coil around his heart for the first time. "Lord, my God," he whispered to the wind, "I have done as you commanded. I spoke of the king, I spoke of the servant, and now I am alone. Did I hear you wrong? Was it all a delusion of a weary mind? Why would you show me these things, only to abandon me in the darkness? Show me, please. Show me what it all means." As he finished his plea, there was no thunder or light. Instead, a heaviness settled over the air. The wind died. Isaiah fell to presence, not the radiant glory of the temple, but a solemn, sorrowful majesty, a holy grief. And then the vision came, not gently, but like a door kicked open in his mind. He was no longer on the hill. He was in the midst of a screaming, angry mob. The smell of sweat, dirt, and hatred filled his nostrils. And then he saw him, the servant. His face was swollen and disfigured from beatings. A crude crown of thorns pressed deep into his brow, sending streams of blood down his face to mix with his tears and sweat. Yet his eyes, in that ruined face, held a look of pained serenity, an incomprehensible love. The servant was carrying a heavy, rough-hewn wooden beam on his raw, lacerated shoulders. He stumbled with every step, falling to his knees, only to struggle up again. Determined to go on, the crowd jeered, spat, and threw stones at him. "No, stop. What are you doing? He is innocent," Isaiah screamed in the silence of his mind, tears streaming down his face. But no one heard him. He was an invisible spectator, forced to witness the most horrific of tragedies. The vision pulled him along to another hill, a place called the Skull. He saw brutish soldiers throw the servant back against the wooden beam. He heard the sickening thud of a heavy hammer, the sound of a large, rusty iron spike being driven through the servant's wrist, pinning it to the wood. Isaiah flinched, the pain shooting through his own body. He heard the crunch of bone, and a soft groan escaped the servant's lips. Then the second spike, then the feet, nailed fast. The beam was hoisted into the air and dropped violently into a pre-dug hole. The jolt tore at the servant's entire body, dislocating his joints. He hung there, suspended between heaven and earth, a portrait of ultimate agony. Isaiah looked down and saw the priests, Eliab among them, standing at the foot of the beam, smirking and shaking their heads. He saved others. Eliab sneered, "Let him save himself. If he is God's chosen one, let God rescue him now." And then Isaiah felt the most terrible thing of all. He felt the silence of God, not a silence of indifference, but the purposeful silence of a father turning his face away as his son bore the full weight of humanity's sin. It was the ultimate separation, the true hell. The servant looked up at the darkening sky and let out a heart-shattering cry. My God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry ripped Isaiah's soul apart. He understood. The servant was not just suffering physical pain, he was suffering judgment, the abandonment of God himself, in place of Isaiah, in place of Jerusalem, in place of the world. He watched the servant bow his head and breathe his last. The vision vanished. Isaiah collapsed to the ground, his body racked with uncontrollable sobs. He clutched his head and screamed, but only the wind answered. He had been shown the cost, and the cost had nearly destroyed him. He had asked for an answer, and God had shown him a covenant written in blood and shadows. He lay there, a broken man on a desolate hill, wondering how he could possibly survive having seen such a thing. How does one go on living after having witnessed the abyss of suffering? As the eastern sky began to blush with the promise of a new day, Isaiah's world remained trapped in a profound night. He still lay on the hill, his body numb from cold and exhaustion, his soul hollowed out by the storm of his vision. The horrific images of the previous night were seared into his mind, as vivid as if they were still happening. The vision of the servant's death had not just broken Isaiah, it had crushed him. All seemed lost. The hope of a king, a prince of peace, now seemed like a cruel lie in the face of a tortured body and a cry of despair. His mission felt like a tragedy, a prophecy of God's own failure. Jeremiah, who had spent a sleepless night worrying, had come searching for his friend. He found Isaiah curled on the ground, his clothes damp with dew and dust. He rushed to his side and knelt. "Isaiah, by the Lord, what happened to you? You look as if you've seen a ghost." Isaiah slowly sat up, his movements stiff. He looked at Jeremiah, but his eyes were vacant, staring right through his friend. Not a ghost. Jeremiah. Something far worse. I saw him. I saw him. Who? Jeremiah asked, confused. Who are you talking about? The servant. The king. All of it. I saw them nail him to the wood. I heard his cry. I watched the darkness swallow him. It's over. Jeremiah. It was all for nothing. The redemption I preached, it's dead. Jeremiah was speechless. He had never seen his friend like this. The fire in Isaiah's eyes was extinguished, leaving only cold ash. He helped Isaiah to his feet, supporting his friend's stumbling steps. As they made their way down the hill, Isaiah suddenly froze, his eyes wide, staring at the empty space before him. Wait, he whispered. Another vision, fleeting and baffling, flashed before his eyes. It was not horrific like the last one, but quiet and strangely unbelievable. He saw a garden at dawn. He saw a tomb carved into a rock face, its heavy stone rolled away from the entrance. He looked inside. The tomb was empty. There was no body. There were only the white linen grave clothes, not thrown about in haste, but folded neatly, as if the one who had lain there had left without a hurry. And then the entire tomb was filled with a brilliant, warm light, a light that pulsed with life. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Isaiah blinked, shaking his head, pressing his hands to his temples. What is it, Isaiah? Jeremiah asked. What did you see now? I don't know. Isaiah answered, his voice full of bewilderment. It makes no sense. A tomb, empty, the linens, and a light, an empty tomb. Perhaps that is a sign of hope, Jeremiah offered. Isaiah looked at his friend with an almost desperate expression. Hope? How can there be hope after what I saw? A man who is dead cannot rise. This only confuses everything further. Am I losing my mind? Jeremiah, has my grief created a fantasy to comfort itself? This new vision brought Isaiah no peace. On the contrary, it plunged him into a deeper crisis. The certainty of sorrow was easier to bear than the absurdity of an unexplainable hope. He felt torn in two. One part of him was still weeping before a tortured body on a cross. Another part was trying to comprehend the meaning of an empty tomb and a light that was not of this world. They returned to his home in silence. Isaiah sat down among his scrolls, but he did not write. He simply stared at the wall, trying to assemble the shattered pieces of a divine mosaic he could not understand. He had seen death. He had seen a sign of life. But how could both be true? Lord, he whispered to himself, what are you trying to tell me? Is this a cruel joke, or a truth so magnificent that the human mind cannot possibly grasp it? Isaiah was standing on the threshold of the greatest revelation. He had all the pieces: the king, the servant, the agonizing death, and the mysterious empty tomb. He was only missing the golden thread that would bind them all together. He did not know it yet, but the answer to God's riddle was about to be given to him. For days, Isaiah remained shut in his small room, surrounded by his scrolls. He did not eat or sleep, but sat lost in silence, wrestling with the warring images that tormented his mind. His face grew gaunt, but his eyes burned with an unusual intensity. He was a man trying to solve a cosmic equation. His mind was a battlefield. On one side stood the image of the crucified servant, the symbol of ultimate failure and pain. On the other, the image of the empty tomb and the light of life, the symbol of an inexplicable victory. The two visions clashed, cancelling each other out. A king could not be executed like a criminal. A dead man could not leave behind an empty tomb. He paced his room, the questions swirling in his soul. Why? Lord, why did you show me both? He stopped before one of the scrolls. It was the one where he had written of the Prince of Peace. He reread his own words. The government will be on his shoulders. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He let out a bitter laugh. He picked up another scroll, the one describing the servant. He was despised and rejected. He was pierced for our transgressions. 2 stories. Tu destinies. It is impossible, he said aloud, his voice thick with desperation. A glorious king, a suffering servant, light and shadow, a crown and thorns, a throne and a cross. They cannot coexist. In a fit of frustration and confusion, he threw both scrolls to the floor. They unrolled, landing side by side. And as he looked down, seeing the 2 lines of text from 2 different scrolls lying next to each other, something miraculous happened. It was as if a bolt of lightning struck his mind. A revelation came, not from a new vision, but from the connection of all he had already seen. A familiar voice, the voice from the throne, echoed not from without, but from the very depths of his soul, not to give a new vision, but to explain the old ones. My child, the voice resonated within him. Why do you look for 2 when there is only 1? You have separated what I have joined together. Do you not understand? To be the greatest king, he had to become the humblest servant. True glory is born not of power, but of sacrificial love. How can the Prince of Peace bring peace between man and God if he does not become the sin offering that tears down the dividing wall of guilt? Isaiah froze, his breath caught in his throat. The gears in his mind began to turn, clicking into place with an audible snap. He fell to his knees, picking up the 2 scrolls, tears now streaming down his face. But these were not tears of sorrow or confusion. They were tears of overwhelming, awe-filled understanding. They are one, he whispered, his voice trembling with amazement. The king and the servant are one. He understood. The cross was not the failure of the throne. It was the throne, the ultimate throne of supreme love. The crown of thorns was not a mockery of kingship. It was the crown, a crown of suffering borne on their behalf. Death was not the end of the kingdom. It was the doorway into an eternal one, and the empty tomb was the final declaration. It was the proof that death itself could not hold the King of Life. Jeremiah, worried by his friend's prolonged silence, gently pushed open the door. He saw Isaiah kneeling on the floor, not in despair, but with his face strangely illuminated, as if the light from the empty tomb were radiating from him. Isaiah, are you all right? Isaiah looked up at his friend, a radiant, tear-streaked smile on his face. All right, Jeremiah, I am more than all right. I see it. I finally see it. See what? Isaiah stood up, clutching the scrolls. The symphony. Jeremiah. It was never separate notes. It is a complete symphony. The judgment, the promise, the suffering, the glory. They are all movements in the same grand story. The story of a king who so loved the world that he became a servant. He came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The riddle was solved. The paradox was unified. Isaiah no longer carried the burden of fragmented pieces. He now possessed a treasure, the complete story of God's redemptive love. He knew his mission had now changed. He would no longer preach judgment or hope as separate ideas. He would tell a story, the greatest story ever told. And he knew this story had the power to change everything. When a man understands the why, he can bear almost any how. The next morning, a profound change had settled over Isaiah. The torment was gone, replaced by a deep peace and a clear purpose. He no longer walked like a man bearing a burden, but like one carrying a precious gift. He returned to the square, the very place where he had been mocked and driven away. Having grasped the why of the servant's suffering and the king's humility, he no longer feared the rejection of men. Their words were but a fleeting noise compared to the eternal truth he now held. His mission was no longer to persuade, but to sow. He would plant the seeds of the story of redemption and trust God to make them grow in any heart that was ready. When the crowd saw him, they were at first contemptuous, ready to walk away. But there was something different about him today. His voice was not the shout of judgment or the whisper of pain. It held a warmth, a certainty full of compassion. "My brothers, my sisters," he began, "before I told you of a glorious king, and you hoped. Then I told you of a suffering servant, and you were angered. Today, I have not come to speak of two men, but to tell you the story of the one." Curiosity kept a few people rooted to the spot. Even High Priest Eliab, who was passing by, stopped in the distance, arms folded, watching to see what new madness Isaiah would perform. Isaiah's voice was that of a storyteller, sharing a sacred secret. Imagine a king who so loved his people that when he saw them chained in the dungeon of their own despair and sin, he did not send his armies. Instead, he took off his royal robes, put on the rags of a prisoner, and entered the dungeon with them. He lived as they lived, felt their pain, and then used his own life as the key to break open the prison doors. These words touched something deep in his listeners. This was not complex theology. It was a story of love. "The one I speak of is just so," Isaiah continued. "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." For the first time, the words of suffering did not provoke anger, but awe. The idea of someone suffering for another, of a love so great it would willingly take a punishment it did not deserve, was a radical and powerful concept. An elderly woman, who had previously screamed at Isaiah, timidly stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Sir, is there truly such a love? Someone willing to be crushed?" "For me," Isaiah looked at her with a gentle gaze. "Madame, not just for you, but for all of us. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." From a distance, Eliab felt uneasy. Isaiah was no longer speaking in ways that were easy to refute. He was speaking of something Eliab's law could not offer: grace. The high priest turned and walked away, but a few of the younger priests with him remained behind. Listening intently, Isaiah's voice now swelled with hope and power. And that is not the end of the story, for death could not hold him. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. He will rise, and through his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. The symphony was presented in its fullness, from the pain to the glory, from the cross to the empty tomb, from the sacrifice to the resurrection. Isaiah had sown the seeds. He saw a few people wiping away tears. He saw couples holding hands. He saw a small group, a remnant, gathering around him after the main crowd had dispersed, wanting to hear more. They were the first patches of barren ground, beginning to soak in the rain of grace. Jeremiah came to his friend's side, his own eyes shining. "You did it, Isaiah. Do you see? They are listening. Not all of them, but some are truly listening." Isaiah looked at the small group gathering around him, a peaceful smile on his face. "My job is to sow the seed, Jeremiah. It is God's work to make it grow. Today, a few seeds found good soil. That is enough." He knew the battle was not over. There was still doubt, still hatred, but he was no longer alone. The story he told was beginning to create a new community, one based not on law or bloodline, but on awe for a sacrificial love. He had begun his work in a barren land, and the first green shoots of a great harvest were beginning to appear. Time is a relentless river, eroding mountains and fading the memories of men. Years passed. Isaiah was now an old man. His hair was silver, and the lines on his face told the story of a life filled with storms and grace. He sat in his familiar writing room, the lamplight illuminating scrolls that were yellowed with age. Outside, Jerusalem was still a city of turmoil, but within Isaiah there was a deep and settled quiet. He was completing his legacy, a legacy not of silver or gold, but of a scroll that would echo through the centuries. He carefully wrote the final words on a scroll, his hand trembling slightly with age, but each letter still filled with power. He was writing of the promise of a new heaven and a new earth, where God would wipe away every tear, where there would be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. He will swallow up death forever, he whispered as he wrote. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. When he set down the reed pen, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. His whole life flashed before him, his brokenness before Jerusalem's silence, the terror and glory in the temple, the feel of the burning coal on his lips, the confusion of proclaiming a king and a servant, the sting of mockery and the rejection of his family, the utter loneliness on the desolate hill. He remembered the soul-crushing pain of witnessing the death of the innocent, the bewilderment before the empty tomb, and finally, the ecstatic moment when all the pieces came together into one perfect symphony. Jeremiah, now a middle-aged man himself, entered quietly, carrying a cup of water. He looked at his friend and mentor with profound respect. You have finished. My teacher. Isaiah opened his eyes and smiled gently. My part is finished. Jeremiah, I was merely the scribe. I have written down the music. But one day, the conductor himself will come to perform it. I still wonder sometimes, Jeremiah said, if people will truly understand what you have written, hundreds of years from now, will they believe such a fantastic story? A virgin giving birth, God becoming a man, only to die, and then rise again. Isaiah gazed at the burning oil lamp. Our task is not to worry if they will believe. Our task is to be faithful to the light we have been shown. Look at that lamp. It does not try to convince the darkness. It simply burns, and its presence is its witness. This scroll is the same. It will remain, a burning lamp through the generations. When the time is right, when the servant king actually walks this earth, these words will no longer be prophecy. They will become evidence. He took the scroll, rolled it carefully, and handed it to Jeremiah. Guard this. Pass it on, for within it is not just a story of the past or future. Within it is the expressed heart of God, a plan laid out before the foundation of the world, a love that would not be deterred by betrayal, a love that could not be extinguished by death. In his final moments, Isaiah stood by the window, looking toward the distant horizon. He no longer saw the earthly, sinful Jerusalem. In faith, he saw a new Jerusalem, a city where the Prince of Peace reigned, where those healed by his wounds were singing. He could not see the events that would unfold 700 years later, but he felt their certainty as if they had already happened. Isaiah had completed his mission. He had solved God's riddle. He had written the symphony of the Redeemer. He, a fragile man, had been chosen to be the pen of the Eternal One, leaving behind a legacy that would challenge, comfort, and illuminate humanity until the end of time. His story is a reminder that even in the deepest silence, God is still speaking. Even in the most terrifying darkness, he is still writing a story of light, and when he has spoken, his word will never return empty. It will accomplish its purpose, like a symphony, waiting for the perfect moment to be played, echoing across the universe. And that legacy, written in fire, still burns brightly to this very day, waiting for all who have ears to hear and a heart to believe.